ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here for our third presentation in our Safe Schools, Brave Spaces training series. As we've talked about in other ones, oftentimes at Youth Summit, we would have a block of professional development sessions. This year, since Youth Summit won't be happening in person, we're offering some virtual professional development pieces. And so one thing I will just state is that the recording from last week's session, which was a great conversation that I was able to have with LaShonda Sugg around bringing a trauma-informed lens to a coming out process, is available on the GLSEN YouTube, our GLSEN Greater Cincinnati YouTube. So I'll put the link in the chat if you wanted to save that. And we'll also email that out along with today's link when that gets recorded or uploaded. So we have those if you want to share any of the information with colleagues. So today's session coming out, Intersectional, looking at experiences around the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality, is really because GLSEN has historically had in the fall what they've called Ally Week. And based on feedback from students, they kind of pushed for that shift to go from Ally Week to Solidarity Week. It's a little bit more about thinking about acting with intention around the efforts that you are making in liberation. And so we're going to talk with our panelists today a little bit more about that thought around solidarity and as well identity. And also we know that this weekend, which originally would have been the Youth Summit, is a National Coming Out Day. And so this panel kind of combining some of the elements of National Coming Out Day and Solidarity Week to be able to hear stories and think about how we can support others that we work with, particularly students who have not mainstream been kind of the focus historically of the LGBT community. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists. So first off, I'd introduce myself. My name is Sean Jeffers. I'm the lead trainer and Youth Summit coordinator for GLSEN Greater Cincinnati. And our panelists today, so we have with us Dr. Brandy Blessed. Brandy is from the University of Cincinnati. We have David Weaver, who is a co-founder of Youth at the Center and as well co-founder of, or a founder of Public Ally Cincinnati, and now lives in Hollywood, Florida. And then Ariel Shaw, and Ariel is a public ally at Youth at the Center. So it's a Youth at the Center heavy, so that's my day job when I'm not volunteering for GLSEN. And so excited to have folks that I have worked with in a number of different capacities here to join us for this conversation. So I did a little bit of introduction, but I'm gonna ask you each to kind of maybe share a little bit of introduction and just kind of as you introduce yourself, just maybe share with us maybe what identities are most salient for you as you start today's conversation. Cool. So I'm gonna go to Dr. Blessed first.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm excited to be on the panel. I think this is such an important discussion. So for me, I am an associate professor at UC. I'm the director of the Masters of Public Administration program. We have an explicit social justice focus. And for me, what that means is being able to prepare public service professionals to be responsive to the diversity of our society, right? To understand how institutions and structures create and has facilitated disadvantage for communities of color and for people at the margins and at the intersection, right? And so this work is really important to me. And I think that, again, this conversation is important. It is illuminating what a summer can do in terms of how we are grasping language and using language in a very different way. And by the summer, I'm speaking specifically of the civil unrest, but also thinking about COVID and all of the intersections for how policies and institutions have really revealed themselves to be contributors to the disparity that and the disadvantage that that communities of color specifically are faced with. Adding on to that, the intersectional identities of being a person of color, being poor, being male, being female, being on the spectrum, being trans, right? Like all of those things create a cumulative experience that we as a society need to understand that nuance and really need to understand, again, how to be responsive to and supportive of people and communities. And so as I think about this moment, my Black identity is the first thing. So if I had to prioritize the three, my Black identity would be the first thing that is always first and forefront in my mind. It's the thing that people see when I walk through the door. And it's just the thing that I carry with me. I'm Black first and foremost. I guess the second would be the fact that I'm a woman, right? And in terms of my presentation, right, like I'm more masculine of center, or so less female or femme presenting. And so I know that becomes an issue, or people are sometimes just kind of giving me the look like, I don't know. Right. But in terms of my identities, first being Black, first being a woman, and then being a lesbian. Right. And so I think my sexuality, although is important, I think it plays less into my identity, or at least my experiences, particularly in this virtual environment, right? Like it's less of an issue in this space than it has been previously. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. David, please introduce yourself and kind of let us know what identities are most salient for you.
Good evening again. My name is David Weaver. If I'm going to go for salient identities, I'm also going to pretty much mirror Dr. Blessed. I was Black before I was anything else. And so Black, male, and I would say sexual orientation, but I'm going to say age, honestly, at this point. It's in many spaces I've been having conversations. Age is like the thing that keeps coming up for me in multiple different ways. How I view myself, how I am viewed, how I feel during the course of my days. Age is playing a huge part in that. And I will say, I will definitely talk about sexual orientation as a gay man after that. But quite frankly, because of what age I am, nobody cares I'm a gay man. That doesn't really matter in a lot of different ways. It'll become invisible in yet one more way in my life in a lot of different things. And so as we talk about various experiences and what a lot of this means, that will be sort of an ongoing theme, is this ongoing piece around invisibility in all the places that I feel like I have been. Background wise, so many different things. Again, Dr. Blessed talked about, the basic work she does. I do a lot of that same work. I do it really focused on with Teach for America at this point, trying to help an organization that sends a lot of folks into communities of color who desperately need to be able to examine their own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors and identities as they step into these communities. And so a lot of that work is what it is that I do for Teach for America. And I come by that the same way that Sean introduced me. I come by that through my work at Children's Defense Fund. I come by that through my work at the Public Allies. I come through that by my work at the National Conference for Community and Justice. And I come by that through the opportunity that I had to be with Sean and Tanisha Worthy to create Youth at the Center. So happy to be here with you all and happy for this conversation.
Next, we'll go to Ariel. So welcome, Ariel. Please introduce yourself and let us know your salient identities.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. Hello. My name is Ariel Shaw. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm a recent college grad. I am, thank you, first generation, recent college grad. Right now I work at Public Allies, and my placement is at Youth at the Center with Sean, which I love. But outside of Public Allies, I am
not paid to say that.
Huh?
I said you were not paid to say that.
Yes. Yes, no, that Sean was not paid to say that. But yeah, no, outside of that, I am an actor, I'm a creator, I am a playwright of sorts, done a lot of different things. But yeah, and as for my most salient identity, I would go with both my Blackness as one and my transness as another one, because I think being Black in America is tough. You deal with racism, you deal with discrimination, you deal with so many different obstacles in your way because of white supremacy. And my other identity would also have to, my other salient identity would also have to be my transness, because I think, you know, it's hard being Black in America, but when you tie being both Black and trans, and specifically to be both Black and a trans femme, I think that is a unique experience unlike any other, because you're dealing with toxic masculinity, you're dealing with misogyny, you're dealing with racism from from not just white people but also white LGBTQ people. And then you're also dealing with transphobia at the hands of your own community. And so I think for me, it would have to be both my Blackness and my transness.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves and being here with us today. So as we shared at the beginning, GLSEN this year made the change from Ally Week to Solidarity Week, and that was requested by students on the national leadership, kind of National Student Council that GLSEN convenes. And so one of the, I think, concerns had just been that, like, ally sometimes is this idea of somebody can show up and self-identify as an ally, but the folks who maybe are in need of that help do not see that person as an ally or do not reach out to that person, versus thinking about being in solidarity is more maybe about, you know, acting with intention, working towards collective action, some of those things. But that's kind of a little bit around the change, but I'd love to hear from you all just shortly around kind of what solidarity means to you, based on either the identities you just shared or just in your broader work. So Ariel, if you'll start us on this one, please.
Yeah, so solidarity to me means holding the microphone, but not speaking into it. And what I mean by that is, solidarity is if you're in a room and it's all cis people, but one trans person, and and all the cis people are, they're just talking, and you're like, hey, maybe so and so has something to say. That is what solidarity looks like to me. Solidarity to me also looks like maybe you happen to be a salon owner and you want to be inclusive of everyone who comes in. So, so maybe you put like a pride flag out, or a trans flag out. For me, it's little things like that to kind of say, okay, so this person is in solidarity with XYZ, but solidarity is also calling out your homophobic friends or your transphobic friends who make rude comments, and it's also acknowledging that sometimes you don't know everything, and it's also acknowledging the past mistakes that you've made. But yeah, that's what solidarity looks like to me.
Thank you. David?
So when I think allyship, I think I went straight to the idea of identity. It was the goal of sort of looking and seeing and trying to stand with someone in support of that identity. Sometimes that's a shared identity, sometimes it's not. When I think about solidarity, for me, it's more of an alignment of values and an understanding that our fates are interwoven. And so standing together is more of a natural extension of our humanity. It allows us to see one another as I can see me in you, and thus my standing up for you is standing up for myself in a lot of ways. It can be in a lot of ways connected to the idea of identity, but it's not solely rooted in the idea of identity. And not that allyship is either, but I feel like allyship for me feels much more aligned with this idea of seeing and thinking about someone's identity and standing with that. But the solidarity is, in a lot of ways, I feel like it's deeper. It's connected to values.
I I can only echo what has already been said. I guess the thing that I'll initially start with is this idea of allyship. And it's interesting because I'm in spaces where folks always want to call themselves an ally, even though they don't demonstrate the characteristics of an ally, right? And so it's an opportunity that you bestow upon yourself to say that I've done this very superficial thing, and so I'm now an ally. And I've learned just through conversations that, you know, allyship is a title bestowed upon you. So people who are in community, who are of vulnerable communities, if they value your work, if your words are matched with action and it's consistent, then they should hold the right to call you an ally. It's like people calling themselves humble. Like, humble people don't say they're humble, right? You know, so in that regard, like, I don't think that we should be calling ourselves allies. I think that people in this, I think people in the fight for justice and equity should be able to identify who their allies are based on their commitment, their actions, based on their ability to use their privilege to engage in advancing the needs of the most vulnerable, right? And so when I think about solidarity, just to echo what David and Ariel has already said, it's like, how are you using your privilege to advance these goals, right? Like, what does that look like in the workplace? What does that look like around the dinner table when you know, it's holiday time, right? Like, folks, this is a time where there's going to be all these hot button current event social issues being discussed, and whether those people are in the room or not, right? Like, how are you going to facilitate and challenge these discussions and stereotypes and prejudicial behaviors of family members and friends, right? For me, that is what solidarity is, and that's how it looks in practice. And so I think more than anything, like, if we're talking about solidarity, and I really appreciate Ariel's conversation around the fact that, like, there is this LGBTQ umbrella for which we may all sit, but there's still a level of privilege associated with whiteness and with maleness, right? And the ability for those folks to use that privilege of whiteness and maleness, even within the umbrella of LGBTQ identity, really creates attention and really pulls resources and acknowledgement and all of these other things away from these other communities who sit at the intersection. And I think that's the part that, if we're talking about solidarity, this can't just be a Black issue or Black people or Black LGBTQ people pushing for the needs and rights and advancing or protecting Black trans women, right? Like, this should be an issue that all people, particularly LGBTQ people, identifying people, are rallying around, and should just be upset anytime we hear of another murder or victimization of a Black trans woman, right? Like, this shouldn't just be an issue for people who identify or who are closely associated with those things. And so, solidarity for me is aligning your actions. It's moving beyond the words, right? Like, I'm tired of people having a conversation about what they're willing to do, and when being put in a position, they don't do it. So
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So you mentioned about how the violence of Black trans women shouldn't be something that is talked about among Black trans people. Everyone should be talking about it. Everyone should be figuring out ways, well, how do we stop this? So I actually, my sister, who was trans, she was a victim of violence. It wasn't anything transphobic related, but she very much, she was a victim of violence, and it was hard for me, because it's like, okay, so when are we going to start talking about how the news misgenders people? Mm-hmm. When are we going to start talking about how all the news cares about, it's painting some picture perfect story, And on top of that, I also want to add that the thing about being in solidarity with LGBTQ people, especially LGBTQ people of color, is that you have to learn to be uncomfortable. You have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because if you don't, You know, if you aren't uncomfortable having these conversations, then you aren't learning, you aren't growing.
And so now we're going to get into a back and forth here. No,
Yeah.
but I can only echo and just, I very much appreciate that conversation, because now again, in the space of civil unrest, we're starting to have uncomfortable conversations about systems of oppression. But again, that's still at a very high level. We're still talking racism, sexism, classism. We haven't even dug into identity and the nuance of that and the intersections, right? And so when we're talking about being uncomfortable, we're talking about all of it, right? Like not just the things that are right, not just the things we're familiar with. Like we're familiar with what racism looks like and what sexism looks like and what classism looks like.
Let's talk about how these identities intersect. Let's talk about racism and classism, you know, and how it affects Black mothers. Let's talk about how Black men are often privileged compared to their counterparts in the Black community. Let's talk about it.
Right. And that's the part where we're missing. So much of the difficult conversations that we want to have are still compartmentalized, right? We don't understand intersectionality in a way that allow us to get at the root cause issue of how all of these systems inform, influence, and cooperate with each other to create disadvantage.
And, you know, and I think intersectionality has become a buzzword.
Yep.
You know, almost, you know, and I see so many well-meaning white people throw it around, but do you really understand what intersectionality is? It was created by Black women for Black women. This isn't a term that was made to help white people.
Right.
So thank you. Yeah, there's a one other thing, and this is for the audience to like kind of deepen understanding later if you want, but there's an author, Bettina Love, who wrote a book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, and she runs the Abolitionist Teaching Network, and her phrase, instead of solidarity or allyship, is co-conspirators. And so in this clip, she tells a story about kind of putting yourself and like kind of when you have privilege, kind of putting that on the line to like help liberate others. So that's an opportunity for individuals to kind of deepen understanding. So there's a lot of really great, so I think there's a lot of times where, you know, like the origin of words get lost or the meaning of some of those things get lost in that. But Brandy, one of the things you were talking about was just this idea of like coming out, but, you know, experiencing largely a white male dominated kind of, you know, LGBT space or historically LGBT, you know, dominated space. And so with the identities each of you shared about, you know, that are most salient for you as you come in today's conversation, wanted to talk a little bit about coming out and one, navigating LGBTQ spaces, navigating Black family spaces or, you know, friend spaces, and just sometimes how some of that played out for each of you. And so this is kind of really, but more about a little bit about your coming out experience, but just navigating some of those communities with your identities. So David, are you willing to start us off on this one?
Sure. I talked a little bit about invisibility before. Invisibility in the sense that I feel like my experiences was sort of like, I didn't really fit in anybody's box, regardless to what the box was. I am the very, very, very tail end of the baby boomers in terms of when it is I was born. I was in that generation of, you know, when I came into my my the years in which I was like graduating from high school, going to college. This is like the beginning 80s. So the thing that dominated my sexual orientation around that time was AIDS. And so there's a very, very different generational aspect of sort of what the focus was during the course of my time period. As I knew about my sexual orientation by the age of about, you know, 10 or 11, when I actually had words to put with it. But as I shared with you about the time frame that I was in when I was of age to actually do anything about it, you know, HIV/AIDS was sort of like the main thing that I heard about. And so that was the thing that I think kept me in the closet. And so kept me in the closet to the point where I went into the probably what I believe to be the most restrictive environment I could. I went to the military. And so when I actually came out, I came out in the military, and this was pre Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so, you know, only to find that there were, guess what, a whole lot of gay folks in the military. But where I was stationed during the course of that time period, I was 100 miles away from San Francisco in the late 80s. And so context matters in terms of where it is you are, what is going on in the world around you, and how that shapes the way you see yourself in the midst of the experience. And so I didn't formally come out until I actually have the date, usually September 9th, 1989. My dad passed away in August. I was came back to Cincinnati to help my family bury my dad. I went back to California where I was in the military, got off the plane, got off my clothes and went to a gay bar for the first time. And so it was a very, very liberating piece in terms of my father's death. And my siblings shared a lot about their own liberating experiences during the course of that time period. But that was when, you know, that was actually when I felt like I could live into it. As fate would have it, I walked into the bar, walked up, got a drink, turned around, and there was a woman who lived on my floor in my barracks who just looked at me and goes, "I always knew you was family." And that was sort of like the beginning of how it is that experience began to shape me. It changed my ideas about being in the military and being gay. My supervisor, my NCOIC, basically told me, she goes, "Sweetie, I don't care I don't care who it is you having sex with, as long as it's not my husband." And that was the way in which it was approached. And so many people talk about these institutions as being, you know, the oppressors in a lot of ways. And institutions are made up of people. You know, institutions are made up of people. I had a boss who was fine. I had my officers, the commanding officers who oversaw my work, who basically found out and were like, you know, you show up, you do your work, you know, you show up in the ways that you need to, and you live into the things that you say you're going to do, and that's really all that's important to us. And so my experience actually was not horrible in the military, but what happened was it was mirrored the rest of my life in terms of people who I got the most flack from, the people who I got the most hatred, and people who I got the most intolerance from were the Black men. And for a host of reasons, that was the way I grew up. Whether it was the way I talked, whether it was the things that I was interested in terms of my education, whether or not it was the sports I decided to play. It was consistently, I was not in a place where I belonged with Black men. I wasn't Black enough. You know, for gay people, I wasn't quite gay enough. Definitely wasn't white enough for white folks. So I had felt like I had spent a lot of my life trying to navigate different spaces, somewhat going unseen, which can be both a blessing and a curse in a lot of different ways. I understand how to navigate spaces. I read people really well. I learned how it is to navigate white supremacy culture, and I have used that to my advantage in a number of different ways. And I've also learned how to perfect the art of incremental radicalism, to utilize whatever privilege that I actually have gained over the course of the time period to create change in these really incredible bursts. And then to be able to find opportunities to sort of, when the situation and the conditions do not allow for that kind of change to happen on that level, I know how to lay in wait. And I know how to put together the things that need to be put together in order to create more change when the opportunity arises again. So at 56 years old, when you think about growing up Black, gay, Cincinnati, Ohio, through the military, having lived through all those different experiences, having grown through all those experiences, having created and founded and creating opportunities for others during the course of those time periods, you know, I feel pretty good. You know, I feel pretty good about what it is that I've now been able to do with my life, to do with my privilege, to create opportunities for other folks. And I'm recognizing that my work is not done. And I'm also in the space where I'm trying to figure out my role has changed over the course of my lifetime. And where does this leave me at 56? What is my role now in terms of being able to support ongoing change, to support the various communities in which I sit, right? We talked about salient identities, and I don't separate male and Black. As I said beforehand, I was Black before I was anything else. And so those are the things that I feel like I am constantly in a state of thinking about in terms of sort of like, what is my role at this point in my life and in my career? What are the things that I want to do in this moment, you know, because we are at another moment where this is an incremental push, right? We have lots of opportunity, and how am I seeing the role that I play as being useful? What is it that's going to make me feel as though I have contributed at a major time in our history right now?
Sorry, Brandy, will you share next? And like part of it is the audience is sharing, like, you know, like one of the things I want people to kind of think about is like David shared kind of from the generations that he shared, Brandy will share from her generation, then Ariel, and thinking about moving us forward to young people today, you know, but as like, because many of the folks I know on the call are educators and things, but thinking about just kind of some different experiences as you're hearing these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Detroit. I guess I didn't come out until I was in college. And but knew a lot of gay people, right? Throughout high school, I played basketball. So in a lot of ways, right? Like I saw the community within the sport, right? And so that was tremendously helpful because it was in Detroit at that time, right? Was a relatively large community, right? And I will say that unlike now, there were places to go and congregate. And I don't know if that was just being in a Black city, but there are clubs and parks and activities that you can engage in and be yourself and be free in a way that I don't necessarily see now, right? When I think about congregating, it's in someone's house that I know. It's not in a club really. And in those clubs, they're predominantly white spaces, right? And so I think for me, coming out at a time when I had community, there were tons of people like me, and we were all trying to figure out our way, was tremendously helpful as I think about growing up and just how I started to come into my own identity. I'm not going to act like there weren't challenges, right? When I was in high school, I started to realize or bring to my consciousness that I liked girls, right? And there was nothing ever said in my family or around me that said that I shouldn't do that, but I felt bad for doing. Like I felt bad for that feeling, right? Particularly because, and I realized that it's the way we're socialized, right? Like it's one of those things that nobody ever said you shouldn't be gay, but it was just one of those things that you just didn't talk about, and you didn't necessarily see other people as role models or who were just out and standing in their truth, right? And so for me, that was a struggle. And then by the time I got to college, I was on my own. I could figure things out for myself. And when I was sure about who I was, I actually wrote my parents a letter, right? And I felt like it was the best way for me to articulate my feelings. And the summation of that letter is, I am still the same person. I am your daughter. I don't want you to think any differently of me because I have feelings for this person who happens to be a woman. I want your support. And I will say that sending my parents that letter and having the support of my family, I could really care less about what anybody else said. Society, the workplace, friend, whatever, like my parents supported me. That's all I ever needed, right? And that's a level of confidence that I wish more people had, because I realized that I realize that's such a challenge. Like when you're not accepted by your family, or you have to live a double life, or you can't just live you can't live and be authentically who you are. And so I just think about, how fortunate I was to be in that space. Again, coming up in a time in Detroit where there were lots of clubs and just things to do and places to go to. At this point in time, I'm an adult. I'm married. I'm in Cincinnati. It's funny, when I moved here a little bit ago, a person asked me, are you single here? I said, no. She was like, good, because you're going to have a hard way to go, right? Like being a queer person in Cincinnati, right? And being Black, right? Because like even being here for 3 years, like I know gay people here, but I don't know where you congregate outside of someone's home, right? Like I don't know that what the social scene is. And I think that makes a difference in terms of visibility, going back to David's earlier point about invisibility, right? To not be able to see yourself or have space to congregate and socialize and have community is limiting in spaces where that doesn't exist. And it particularly for young people, right? As an adult, I can create my own fun. I can hop on a plane. I could do all of these things. But for young people who don't have a safe space, who don't have a place to congregate and socialize and be themselves, I imagine that there's this internal tension that exists about where do I go to be free and where do I go to find me, right? And I think it's so important that, not only are we having these conversations, but the people on this call can help create community for young people, to be supportive, to try to live authentically, and to just try to live in their truth as much as they can, right? A lot of it is identity, a lot of it is growth and maturity and things that you learn and grow over time. But I think that, however we as professionals can create safe spaces for young people in particular who are going to have some challenges struggling with identity issues, is really the key, as we think about creating a space for them to thrive as adults.
So, Dr. Blessed, what year did you come out again?
So I'm an 80s baby. I was in college. I was probably like 19 or 20.
20.
Like when I wrote my parents that letter, I was probably like 19.
Okay. And then like what year was that?
Like 2000, 2001.
Okay, cool. All right. So I came out literally 10 years after you did. So about 2010, 2011. And and David talked about how his like liberation was going to the bar. For me, I found my liberation in a TV show called Glee. And I'm a theater nerd at heart. That's just who I am as a person. I'm an actor, because I do theater. And so for me, I came out because, so I went to a Catholic school, and then when I was in middle school, I ended up coming out to my entire class, but I did not come out to my sister, who was like my legal guardian, because my mother had passed away like maybe 2 years prior, in 2010. So I moved in with my sister, who is like probably in her late 30s at this point. And I didn't come out to her because for me, I always felt like, whenever something queer related happened, she would just always have this like attitude of sorts, if that makes sense, and there was also that other piece of adults yelling at kids, which I don't like being yelled at. I don't. And so, and so that was the other thing too, is that I didn't want to get yelled at. And so I told my class, I told my like nieces and nephews, who were basically like my siblings, because we're all at the same age or so, if not a year or two apart. And so, and so after after she found out, it was kind of like a snowball effect of how things just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and at first, at first it was this whole dynamic of you are a Black man in America first, because this is before I transitioned. I didn't transition until college. And so she's like, you're a Black man in America first, you being gay, that should be private, and this, that, and the other. And so it never was that she wasn't okay with me being queer, but it was this dynamic of you have to be the respectable queer. We don't talk about this outside. We just don't acknowledge it, but meanwhile, we have predators coming into the family. That's a whole other conversation. Anywho, I came out, and I had already felt like the Black sheep of the family because I was the theater kid. I knew all the big musicals, the Tony Awards. I knew about Idina Menzel, Christian Chenoweth, all these big Broadway actors, right? So I was already the Black sheep of the family because I was a theater kid. But I was even more of a Black sheep because not only was I openly gay, but I was I not only was I openly gay, but I was also vocal about it, and I was also the type of person I wanted to find my own community. And so my sister, she didn't like that. She didn't like that I was like super open about it. And so for a longest time, as a result of my own coming out, I struggled a lot with my Blackness, because it wasn't just my queerness that it wasn't just my queerness that distanced me from my like cishet Black peers, but it was also the fact that I was into things that would be considered to be not Black things, like theater, acting, writing poetry, this whole big thing. And so once I got to high school, I really started like exploring my identity and everything. And I realized I was super femme. I realized that I was just very much very, very extroverted kid. And I started getting more and more and more into theater. And so by the time I got to college, one, I seeked out the performing arts school, and see, what can I do there as a non-major? And then two, I ended up getting a job on campus in the LGBTQ center. So the summer of 2016 was when I toured UC, and I had another, I had two orientations that day. I had one for like UC overall, and then I had one for Gen 1, which is like this program focusing on first-gen college students. And so in between those two orientations, I ended up visiting the LGBTQ center. That's how I met the then director, and that's how I ended up securing a job. So I was like, hey, I want to introduce myself, I'm queer, I want to get really involved. Are you hiring? Because I needed the money. And so I ended up getting a job, and I worked there on and off for the next like 4 years. And in my time, during my time in college, I struggled a bit with my Blackness. I really did. It felt like I was too Black for the white queer kids, and then it felt like I was too queer for the Black cishet kids. And so I struggled eternally, and I especially struggled with with connecting with like Black men, whether that be with hooking up, whether that be with just chatting, and by Black men I mean like cishet Black men and just cis Black men in general, because I would always be dealing with some kind of like toxic masculinity. And for the longest time, I felt uncomfortable, saying, I don't feel safe around cishet Black men, because it would always be that with, oh, you're being anti-Black, or oh, you're this, or oh, you're that. But it's true. I don't, and it feels like it feels like no one is talking about this when really it needs to be talked about. Because it's like, the the number the number of Black trans women who have been murdered, about 90% of them, their murderers have been Black men, including my sister. But it's like when I bring it up, I'm always being accused of being anti-Black. Because it's like, no, like if there is a particular group of people who are harming your community in a very big way, such as killing off people in your community, then of course you're going to be hesitant towards them. It's the same way Black people are hesitant to white people because of racism, because of slavery, because of white supremacy. And so yeah, that was my coming out experience. Now I've become sort of this like community spokesperson of sorts, which has been really interesting to me. Even though I'm just talking about my own lived experience, like that's it. But people are like, wow, you're just so inspirational. You're this, you're that, and I'm like, I'm just trying to just live my life, So yeah, that's my experience.
Again, thank you all so much for sharing your stories. We have a few minutes remaining, and I wanted to see if I had a kind of a final question I wanted you all to weigh in on. Let's see if there are any questions from anybody who's joined us today that they'd like to ask the panel. Well, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or come off mute and share. Thank you. So Olivia asks, how can educators create safe spaces for our students? And that was really going to kind of lead into my final question too, is just as we think about Solidarity Week, I think one of the things to build on a little what you asked, Olivia, is that the dynamic of oftentimes there can be, as somebody who works a lot with young people, there can be an sense of adultism that like young people are not heard, valued, seen by adults. And so I think it's like, what can we as adults do to be in solidarity with young people, and being able to advance those pieces, but creating those. So anybody want to weigh in on this question just around like ways to support young people?
I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a former young person, I'm 22. I'm still there, but as a former teenager, like one thing I like to remind adults, especially older adults, is like, do you like being yelled at? Do you like being criticized? Do you like being told to stay in so-and-so's place? If not, then why would you do this to kids? That's one of my pet peeves, especially as a survivor of emotional abuse and emotional trauma that I dealt with my sister. And so I think, what was the question? Oh yeah. So I think, so I think the ways that educators can create safe spaces is remembering that, one, kids are just as much human as you are, and if not more vulnerable. And to add to that too, if a kid does come out, if a kid comes out as trans and says, can you use this name? Can you use these pronouns? Your job is to not ask why. It is not to criticize. It is not to judge. It is not to call the parent. Your job is to say, okay, what can I do to make you feel more safe? And part of that could be, could be calling out students for using transphobic language or making fun of their new name or making fun of their pronouns. Part of it could be going to things like this. It could be, I don't know, it could be educating yourself on what does it mean to be trans? What does it mean to be LGBTQ? Yeah.
Awesome. Brandon, I thought you'd come off mute to jump in, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think all of those things are important. And so one of the things that we try to do in our program specifically, because we realize that we touch on a lot of topics that aren't traditionally discussed in public administration programs, is, take your time, right? Like, you have to develop and build trust with your class. And so one of the things that I know that happens, or that we try to do, is like the first month of class is just getting to know each other, right? Like building that trust and that foundation. To think that you're going to go into or jump into a conversation with people you've only met a week ago and dig deep about institutional racism or LGBTQ identity or transphobia is really like cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? Like, you have to build in these conversations. You have to create space for people to understand where you're coming from, to trust that you are going to be a good facilitator of these conversations, and that you know and have developed the language that, as Ariel pointed out, that is supportive, that is not judgmental. And I guess one of the things I will say is, because we're in a space where everybody wants to talk about social justice and using these buzzwords, like, if you don't know what you're doing, you can cause way more harm than anything else, right? And so part of that is also going to be your own preparation. If you're not capable of having a conversation, bring somebody else in who is. Think about how you need to grow as a professional in order to be in this space, right? I think about educators who are like, well, this is the way we did it in my day. And it's like, well, in your day, it was completely different. It was black and white, it was man and woman, it was English or Spanish, right? Like, this is not where we are in 2020, right? You need to be able to evolve your learning as a professional and as an educator, and really in order to keep up with the times, right? Like, if you want to be engaged in this work and impact children, then you need to be on the journey of lifelong learning, right? There's always going to be new things to learn. There's always going to be new language. There's always going to be current events that you need to be aware of. And as a result of that, not thinking that just because you took a test or you went to one training or been to 10 trainings, that your work as a professional is done. And so how do you create and build language? How do you build facilitation skills? How do you develop trust in your students so that they feel comfortable? They know if someone says something off target or off base in the classroom, that you are going to correct that, right? Like, you're just not going to let those things sit out there for anybody to just fester in an uncomfortable space. Like, we have to be able to call out these things that make situations uncomfortable for all people. And so I think that it's part of our duty and responsibility to take ownership of our own learning and seeing how that translates into the classroom.
Yeah, Dr. Blessed just basically said what we always talk about is do your work so you can do the work. Mm-hmm. And that means that you have to be grounded in your own understanding of, when you show up in a classroom, you just don't show up with your curriculum and your lesson plan, right? There is a whole lot of other stuff that comes with you. Your knowledge of self, your understanding of others, how it is that you create and or see or identify or perpetuate systems of oppression that have been part of the communities with the kids that you serve forever. And so your knowledge of those things has to be part of what you go into a classroom with, so that you are not continuing to be someone who perpetuates those things in the classrooms where you are actually trying to break down those barriers and those walls, right? And so a lot of that comes with just your own identity work that creates, that helps you become more of a vessel for change as opposed to one perpetuating the systems that we're trying to fight against.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
If I can add to what David said, you cannot claim to want to break down systemic oppression if you are repeating the same toxic ideas that you claim to be against.
Yeah, so a lot of what you are talking about, and I think just for educators, if it's something you want to look at with your GSAs or things, is a term, cultural humility. A lot of, like, in the past, I think what was framed was cultural competence, about going to a training and learning. And it was kind of almost framed like, go to this training and you're going to learn cultural competence training for the LGBTQ community, and you're going to leave knowing all the things. But I think cultural humility is kind of said the dynamic of, like, learning is a lifelong process. Because if you think about 5 years ago when we talked about gender, the way we talk about gender now is totally different. Like, you know, and so it's like there's a lifelong process because of how that has evolved and how that is shaped. So I think this is a great talk by Juliana Mosley, who just kind of talks a little bit about her own experience of navigating and exploring cultural humility and how that kind of plays out. So, but I think sometimes getting those things, Emily asked a question too, just around how we can kind of start some of this conversation with young people about, you know, allyship and solidarity. And so any tips, since all three of you, you know, do this work, like, of kind of where you started, like, what was that thing to kind of maybe close us out that, like, was something that kind of started you on this path or helped you to kind of move in this direction of wanting to have conversations around racial justice and broader things around equity?
I think for me, you know, what started my journey is that I've always been a vocal person. I've always been someone who, like, spoke out against something. You know, even when I was, like, a young kid. But yeah, and I guess, you know, what started me on this journey was that I got, you know, I got sick of, of being walked over, especially by my sister. And also too, you know, I'm not the only one whose lives are, are at risk, if you will. You know, immigrants, disabled people, people who might be fat, people who, I don't know, people who may be, people who, people who may be poor, people who may be homeless. And so, and so a lot of that, you know, has fueled me to join the fight against racial injustice, you know, especially my own experiences, because, you know, I know what it's like to be Black and trans. You know, I know what it's like to walk in a gay bar that is just a bunch of white cis gay men and feel uncomfortable. You know, I know what it's like to be fetishized. And so I want to make sure that the generation underneath me, doesn't deal with the things that I dealt with. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I guess I'll just go and say that I think for me, I just have, very similar to Ariel, have always seen injustice. I've always seen a difference, particularly in Black communities, and wanted to know how that happened or how to fix it. But I guess more than anything, as someone who, right, so my other identity, which is privileged, is being a professor, right? And so I am in spaces with people who can make decisions or who have access to resources. And how do I use my privilege to create space and as Ariel pointed out, hold the microphone for folks who need to be heard, right? And I think more than anything, just trying to be very mindful that in any room I walk in, the hierarchy of my privilege is my identities are going to be hierarchically ranked, right? And so, you know, to what extent am I able to use my privilege to really speak out against things that I think are bad, really create space for people to engage. So often we talk about wanting to empower people, and people are empowered. They just need you to get out of the way, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, my my role, particularly as a professor, is how do I create space for my students to engage in this work? How do I partner with community so that their needs are prioritized in any engagement or partnership that we have? How do I how do I best leverage these resources at UC and the expertise of my students and my colleagues to create better systems and better opportunities for engagement, right? I think that is how, or where I sit. I often think that I don't do enough, but I also realize that where I am, I need to just, within my sphere of influence, really work to like extend that out as much as possible to just, again, create opportunities, create space for people to have their voices heard.
I would say ditto. Then I would say what I put in the chat about understanding the context of young people's lives. And then I would go back to the public allies sort of, like mantra that leadership is not a position that few can hold. Leadership is an action that many can take. And helping young people understand, even at a young age, that they have agency and ability to be able to take action about the things that matter to them, about the things that are relevant to them. And I feel like there are so many ways that we can begin conversations about what are the things that you care about, that you actually would take time on a Saturday morning and get up and go do something, where you would show up and be part of something. What do you care about enough to be able to do that? And sometimes it's just asking that question. Sometimes it's about hearing the answer and recognizing that young people don't always have the resources. So you also have to be available to actually help foster some of that. But I feel like it is understanding the context of young people's lives and really making these experiences relevant. Whatever conversations that you're having have to be relevant to their day-to-day, because keeping it all out here at the 30,000 foot level, that serves only to make you feel like you're able to talk the talk. You got to be able to walk the walk with the kids who are actually living it day-to-day.
Awesome. Well, we are at time, so I want to thank our panelists so much. And I think for the audience, hopefully these words have helped and inspired, but also get us thinking a little bit around that aspect of when we see young people who are asking questions. I think a lot of times young people tell us in our work that I asked my teacher why something happens, and then I got yelled at for insubordination because it seemed like I was questioning them, whereas I'm just trying to make sense of it. And so that aspect, when young people ask why, when young people aren't our traditional styles of leaders, as David talked about, everyone has this ability to lead. So what does it look like for us to lift up introverts or people who lead differently? Because we need all of those different types of folks in the movements for change that we want to see happen. So thank you all. This conversation has been recorded. It will also be posted. So everyone who's signed up will be sending out the PowerPoint and resources and video links from all three sessions. And as well, we'll be seeing if there are any other conversations or things you'd like GLSEN to offer moving forward in this school year. But we thank you all for being here tonight, particularly Ariel, David, and Brandy for sharing your stories and experiences with us. And be well. The rest of this Solidarity Week, I did want to put in a plug. If you are working with young people and you go to that Solidarity Link website on GLSEN, tomorrow is disability justice focus, Wednesday is intersex youth, Thursday is Native American Indigenous focus, and Friday is immigrant focus. And they have resources and videos and articles and things all on the website. So I'll put that link one more time in the chat if there are resources you want to use for your students. So, cool.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you all. I hope when outside opens up, we can get together in person one of these days.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Bye.